To get to become a CMO, there's a mission, there's a drive. What is it that's kept you driven?
I'm a geek. I was born a geek. I remain a geek.
Welcome to Leading Beyond the Lab. Today, I'm very excited and pleased to be joined by Danielle Meyrick.
It's absolutely delivering products for patients. I really do enjoy working with teams, seeing them happy, see a team working well together, even across time zones.
One thing that stands out to me about your experience, Danielle, is the different environments you've worked in. And from a leadership perspective, how do you approach those challenges and what are the key differences, if there is any?
I think in the end you sort of ask yourself, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? I became hooked. We were able to see disease that they otherwise didn't know they had. Some of the toxicity profiles are pretty brutal.
What do you think for the future of radiotheranostics, and is there any potential challenges?
Look, there are challenges there. There's going to be a sort of a push to develop these agents pretty quickly. Maybe the technology's not going to keep up. Other challenges lie in workforce. There's just not the supply of nuclear medicine physicians.
Specifically within nuclear medicine, what are the key differences or characteristics that make up a good developer in that space?
I think, we have to first of all remember that
Welcome to Leading Beyond the Lab. Today, I'm very excited and pleased to be joined by Danielle Meyrick, a proven leader in the nuclear medicine space across biotech, pharma, and with a proven background in radiochemistry and academia. Danielle's got a really interesting profile, which we're going to hear more about from in her own words. Unlike most physicians, Danielle started with a PhD, worked her way up in radiochemistry to become an associate professor, before deciding mid-stage in the career that she actually wanted to be a physician. And coming right out of our comfort zone and pursuing that. So thank you very much for joining us, Danielle.
Pleasure to be here.
Would you like to give us a little bit of a synopsis of your career and journey today?
Certainly can, and thanks, Lawrence, for the opportunity to be here. Really looking forward to chatting to you today. So, look, as you said, I started my career as a chemist. I did a PhD in radiopharmaceutical chemistry, not really knowing that existed, when I started my chemistry degree. I really knew nothing about it, and I think it's fair to say I fell into radiopharmaceutical chemistry through the people that I knew. Had some wonderful opportunities working in radiopharmaceutical chemistry, and came upon theranostics at a time which I think, as far as I view things, was the very beginning of, theranostics and radiopharmaceuticals, targeted radiopharmaceuticals as we now know them. This very precise, sort of elegant exploitation of the molecular biology of cancers and attaching radioisotopes to deliver radiation very precisely. So I fell into that at a very exciting time. I had exposure through the clinicians that I was working with, obviously to the clinical environment and to patients and to the impact of radiopharmaceuticals, and eventually came to a point where I recognised that if I was to continue to challenge myself, I suppose, and satisfy my curiosity, the next step was going to be to study medicine. So, as you said, I did that. Well, you didn't say I did it as an old woman, but I thought of myself, as a relative old woman.
Really?
Certainly. I certainly felt that, for sure.
On the course?
I did, yeah. I mean, I was nearly old enough to be a lot of people's mothers. I mean, nearly, not quite. I
think that's amazing that you took yourself out your comfort zone like that.
Well, I mean, at the time it seemed like a big decision,
Sure.
and thanks for saying that. But I think in the end you sort of ask yourself, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? Is it doesn't work, I go back and work as a chemist or whatever the case might have been. So I did it, and it was very purposeful, actually, time of my life, and I thoroughly enjoyed it for the intellectual challenge, and I enjoyed it for the patient interaction, which was something that I was really looking for. The people that I met and the opportunities that it's now provided me. I mean, I've been fortunate that I've been able to work in spaces, let's just say, that have sort of represented the nexus of science and radiopharmaceutical chemistry and the background that I have there, and clinical medicine, in theranostics very specifically. So it's worked out for me, I think, to date, very fortunately. So that brings me here to be talking to you today, Lawrence, in fact. Yeah.
And you're one of the few people I'd say that has taken radioligand treatments actually into the clinic and followed those molecules into the various stages of drug development, which makes you a bit of a unicorn in the current market, where all of a sudden every single company... I actually heard a quote last week from a CMO, a vice president of clinical development at Big Pharma, and he was told that unless we had a nuclear medicine portfolio, we weren't really a big pharma at the moment.
Right.
Which is interesting, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's reflected in, the various acquisitions that you see and all of the activity. If you're not in radiopharmaceuticals, you're not really serious in oncology, I think it's fair to say. So, I think I've been fortunate that, I fell into something that I have become very passionate about and was certainly very intellectually curious about. And it played to my... not just curiosity, but my strengths to an extent. I'm a geek. I was born a geek. I remain a geek. And so, it's a nice mix of that technical component and then again the clinical application. So, very lucky.
And where do you think and why do you think the market has gone gangbusters for nuclear medicine? What makes it such a compelling technology?
I mean, I think it has to be the data. You have to look at the data, you have to look at the patient outcomes. The toxicity profile of radiopharmaceuticals is very positive. These are well tolerated to date by patients, particularly relative to some of the emerging, I guess you could say, competitor oncologic therapies, which are equally as effective, if not better. I mean, and I'm probably not in the best position to comment. I mean, I keep abreast of it, but some of the toxicity profiles are pretty brutal, I think it's fair to say. And so, the precision of radiopharmaceutical delivery with theranostics means that these really are very, very well tolerated. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that, if I go back to when I began in radiopharmaceuticals more than 20 years ago, as you detect from my accent, I'm an Australian. I come from Australia, and we have a very conducive regulatory environment there. So we were using the compassionate access program that we have available in Australia, which is administered by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, but it's very free and open. So we were able to gather a lot of clinical data very, very early on. And we're able to see very early on, together with countries like Germany and the Netherlands and others that have a similar sort of a regulatory landscape, we're able to see these very good outcomes for patients very, very early on. But there were not the prospective clinical trials that you see in oncology, and which are necessary, of course. They're absolutely necessary for registering a product. But for a period of time, there were not those clinical trials. I am getting to answer your question, Lawrence, but and part of the reason was that nuclear physicians have not historically been, I should say, clinical trialists in the same way that medical oncologists are. So you didn't have those trials, which meant that there wasn't quite the acceptance of the data. Of course not, because these were retrospective studies. They were not well-controlled studies that were generating the data. So as soon as there was the initial investment by Big Pharma, which was of course Novartis, and you had that first...
AAA.
AAA, exactly. And we had that first sort of series of prospective clinical trials, phase 3 trials, formalising those clinical outcomes, I guess you could say. That's when everything really, of course, started to take off. So it really just took that initial interest, I guess you could say, and funding, of course, which is important to give us those prospective trials, and then from there it's really taken off. But you can't ignore the clinical data, of course. That's absolutely key.
What do you think separates drug development specifically within nuclear medicine? So if you were giving advice, for example, to an MD who's looking to join a clinical development position in nuke med and they're currently working in, say, traditional oncology, what are the key differences or characteristics that make up a good developer in that space?
It's a good question, Lawrence, and I think, we have to first of all remember that, I have this sort of back to front CV.
So it helps, I imagine, doesn't it?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean,
Chemistry.
yeah, it does. But, I've come into drug development, from the side door or the back door even. And therefore I don't have that traditional drug development view, which might help and perhaps doesn't. I think it helps. But, I think we all know that radiopharmaceuticals are logistically, I don't like to think of it as logistically challenging, but logistically different, to other oncologic treatments in the first instance. So
The half-lives.
the half-lives and, the point of production and the supply chain and all of those things. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the clinical workflow is a little different. So you have the imaging. Well, first of all, you have the point of production of the radiopharmaceutical, and you may do it in-house. It's historically been in-house. That's of course changing to more centralised. But you have the PET imaging, of course, to detect the expression of the target, the extent of disease, and so on. And then you have the administration of the therapy, remembering that these are radioactive products. So there are certain differences with the clinical workflow simply because of that. And I don't think, based on what I intuitively understand from working in those environments, I think that it is critical to understand those things, those differences, when you're designing a clinical trial protocol and when you're trying to understand what's possible, what's not possible, because you're dealing with something radioactive, you're dealing with a radioactive patient from beginning to end, basically, and they need to ultimately go home with, and they may be radioactive, they may not be. And there are just certain things relating to the physical approach of the people in the clinical environment to a patient, because they may be radioactive, and a whole lot of waste management things and various bits and pieces. They're not insurmountable, but I really think they are important to understand because they affect the way you design your protocol. So those are the differences. So I would say simply that to somebody coming from traditional oncology. Come to understand the clinical workflow and spend some time in that clinical environment, in a nuclear medicine clinical environment.
And what about from a personality trait? Because you mentioned curiosity earlier.
Yes,
and that kind of struck a chord with me. I thought that.
Yeah.
I hear that quite frequently with drug developers.
Yep.
Or people that tell me what a good drug developer looks like, or sounds like, or talks like.
Yep.
Is there anything else there that, from a trait, that you think would be worthwhile discussing?
You also heard me mention geek.
You did, I did, yeah.
Yes, so, I think that...
I love that you own it. It's
oh,
great.
Totally. I fly that flag pretty high. But I think you either understand or you would have come upon, the idea of dosimetry in radiopharmaceuticals and, physicists. You probably have supported some of them over the years. So I think having an appreciation of those hard sciences is important. So, yes, there is the clinical application component, the clinical workflow, but you make a really good point, actually, Lawrence, that there are other things. And so curiosity, spending the time to really understand, to the extent that you're able, the physics, the dosimetry, the chemistry even. It's quite helpful to understand that to the extent that you're able. And also, I think drug development in radiopharmaceuticals is potentially a far more multidisciplinary activity than other oncologic modalities. I might be wrong, but really sort of forming a strong team with the chemists, with the physicists, with the nuke med tech, all of that. So understanding the part that each of those disciplines plays, I think, is important.
What do you think for the future of radiotheranostics, and is there any potential challenges? I know people talk about the supply of whether it's actinium or lutetium.
Yep.
Any thoughts on where that's going to go and what the future lies?
Look, there are challenges there, and I always like to think, without understanding in great detail the methods of production for these isotopes. I mean, of course, I understand at a high level how each of them are produced, but I think as long as the demand is there, which will be derived from the data, and the patient outcomes, those technical challenges will be resolved in terms of supply and manufacture, but I think the challenge might be in the time frame. So, you know, there's going to be a sort of a push to develop these agents pretty quickly, and maybe the technology is not going to keep up. So I see that as a challenge. Other challenges lie in workforce.
As in the maturity of the talent pool to pick from? Right.
Yep, correct. So, and, you know, and if you have a look at the United States, for example, Canada is another example. I mean, again, highlight I'm an Australian, so I'm speaking well out of turn, but, you know, there's just not the supply of nuclear medicine physicians who have, of course, historically sort of owned this technology. So, you know, so there's a need now to sort of extend to radiation oncologists, and of course they're taking it on to involve, I think, more medical oncologists in terms of the administration. I mean, the medical oncologists often manage the patient, but I think having them as well, you know, administer these agents and get more involved, which again brings me to sort of the multidisciplinary nature of radiotheranostics and the importance of collaboration and so on. So radioisotope supply and the technology and maturity of the workforce, I think, and even just take a step further. Chemists, physicists, all the entire. It's
different people.
Yeah.
I know. To your point, I remember when I first started placing people from a physician background into radiopharmaceuticals on the therapeutic side, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I remember at that point, we were looking for oncologists. One of the previous companies, RTM being one of them. And I remember the key challenge there was when I was talking to oncologists in drug development, it was trying to talk to them about nuclear medicine and the novel impact that RLT treatments are going to make, and it was, they had no idea. You know, right. It was something they had to go and research. I had to really understand everything about the value proposition of the company, so I could spark the interest.
Yep.
Whereas now,
totally different.
Yeah, now it's totally different. Now they're approaching me saying, Lawrence, you know, that role I didn't want 5 years ago. I'd love one like that now. You know, which is amazing. I mean, back then I think the rule was like cell therapy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But my understanding is, although you have the similarly expensive manufacturing costs and you've got the supply chain complexities in nuclear medicine, you've also got, it's much more scalable and it's less personalised to the patient like a cell therapy product is. So the investment's there, there's less risky, and it's just more interesting from that perspective.
Yeah, and you're totally right. I mean, medical oncologists are now very interested, and again, it's because of the outcomes, the patient outcomes that they've suddenly looked, and they've not suddenly looked, but after a period of time, you can't deny it. But early on, you know, if I go back to the 20 years ago that I mentioned, there was, in fact, I think it's fair to say, you know, I mentioned to you that the studies were retrospective, and so there was resistance on the basis of that, but there was just also resistance, you know, from the medical community at large.
Oh, really? Why is that?
There was, yeah, and I can't quite say why. I mean, I think...
In the same sense as like chemotherapy and things? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it was simply that it was not... Because it's different, it was not easily understood, perhaps. It's a bit of a black box in a way, you know. Yeah, I know what you're saying. It's different enough for it to be out of people's comfort zones, particularly if you're trying to change the behaviours of, I can imagine, physicians who are giving patients these treatments, and they've got to kind of go completely left field with a new suggestion. Right. So it takes time. And I know that one of the themes that I get with nuclear medicine biotechs, from a much earlier stage, we're looking at things like CMC. Mm-hmm. You know, we're hiring chief technical officers or things like that, where they're looking at process and analytical development much earlier than we do in traditional therapeutics. Right. I mean, you have to get all of that sort of squared away. And it's a balancing act, though, because you don't want to make too much investment, of course, in your CMC, you know, early on when you're not quite sure, you know, of even the safety of your agent. So, you know, that adds a layer of complexity. But I think as well, I'm asking myself, why was that resistance there? And again, it's... Okay, I can't just, you know, I'm the physician, but I can't just administer this agent, you know, independently. I need a physicist, I need a radiation safety officer, I need all of these things that, you know, I don't necessarily understand. So I'll just sort of look in the other direction with, you know, towards the, I guess, more traditional agents, I guess you could say. So, but yeah, Very different landscape now. Everybody, well, not everybody, but there's a huge amount of interest, which is great. I mean, that's ultimately what's needed in order to be able to scale and grow and really get
and innovate.
And innovate.
One thing that stands out to me about your experience, Danielle, is the different environments you've worked in. So whether it be, and this is in pharma, whether it be Telix, an established, one of the leaders in radiopharmaceuticals, mid-sized pharma with commercialised products, to a CRO, where you were the CMO, to fractional roles where you've been the strategic CMO for smaller companies, to the likes of ITM. So from a leadership perspective and a team building perspective, how do you approach those challenges, and what are the key differences, if there is any?
Look, I think it's an interesting question. People always ask, what is your style of leadership? It's a sort of a common question. And hopefully I'm answering your question here, Lawrence. But I always think about, working with my teams, and I've worked across time zones, as for many years actually. If I think about all of those companies that you've mentioned, all of them have had a working across time zones component to them, which means working remotely as well a lot of the time, which can make leadership more challenging, but it can also make it more effective because you become more deliberate in the way that you lead the team and more thoughtful, I think. You sort of actively spend time thinking about leading the team. But what has been common, I think for me, from a leadership style, is that I've come to understand the importance of clearing the way for the team. So basically, making sure there are no roadblocks, getting myself out of the way so that the team is able to do their job, providing clarity of sort of direction and purpose, and making decisions in a timely way, even if it's sometimes the wrong decision. You can always course correct. So that's been important. Collaborating with my team, working together with them has always been important. And then that piece there, working together with the team, I think brings me to one of the differences perhaps among the different organisations, which relates to size of team and size of organisation. I think the smaller the team, the smaller the biotech, the earlier phase, it's the more important that collaboration is, and the more important it is for me to be more operational as a leader and more hands-on and prepared to, to use an overused phrase, to wear more hats has been important as well. And that's actually
lead
something...
from the front would be the other overused phrase.
Yeah, but it's important. I think it's important. So, and of course communication is absolutely key. And certainly in a remote environment and working across time zones, communication is absolutely critical.
I think on the remote working thing, I think that's partly a product of nuclear medicine specifically, just because of the limited candidate pool. I think there's
right.
only so many people that have been there and done it,
and
naturally need another wave coming through. But we are where we are, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, and you're right. There are new waves coming through, and so that will change. But certainly early on, and Telix in many ways has been a prototype for how to be a radiopharmaceutical company, because it started in Australia, as you know. It's an Australian company, now has a very big, I was going to say a very big US presence, which is true, but in fact I think it's fair to say it has a very big global presence.
Yeah, I agree,
yeah. And it has people all over the world, and is very proud of that. And working with Telix, that was actually something really lovely, was to have people everywhere. And that included, very remote parts of certainly Australia, remote parts of Europe as well, and non-remote parts of country, many countries. But yeah, it's actually really lovely. And it's something that I've enjoyed is, because of that limited talent pool that you mentioned, it's been fortunate for me that I've been able to work with people from all over the globe.
Yeah, and with Telix specifically, as a market leader in this space, aside from timing, because that obviously helps, but what did they get so right?
Good question. It's important to take risks. So
if you get them right.
Yeah, exactly. They took the right risks. But, I mean, I have to pick up on the timing. You said apart from timing, but yes, it was timing with PSMA-targeted imaging agents. But I think, there's no denying that Chris Behrenbruch, CEO of Telix, understands radiopharmaceuticals very well. He's also, I don't think he would mind me saying, he's also a geek. And, he's been a long time champion of nuclear medicine and radiopharmaceuticals. And he understood the potential impact in terms of clinical management of PSMA targeting agents. So he had conviction. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely critical. You need a leader at the very top of an organisation that absolutely believes in the modality. So I think that's what Telix got very right, is strong belief.
Did they do... So I work with CEOs that have those things, but sometimes they're still working on the building of the plan or the go-to-market strategy. That's the thing they've still got to learn. Mm-hmm. It sounds like Telix had that.
I think so, and I think,
also the most.
Well, and perhaps, but also I think understood what was needed in terms of the human infrastructure to get those things right, and getting a little bit ahead of, the curve, its own curve, or the, say the launch curve or whatever the case might have been, to build the team ahead of when, the team would be needed, if I'm making sense to you. So, just thinking back over my time there, I think that was pretty important.
So basically he has a crystal ball.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Who doesn't? But, interesting time at Telix, and for me, good learning curve, really good learning curve.
And what advice would you give to physicians that are or radiochemists that are currently working in academia or practice and they're thinking about joining the sector? What advice would you have for them when they're going to go about starting that thought process?
It's a good question. And I mean, you said coming out of academia or practice, and those are two separate things.
Yeah.
And
non-industry. Yeah,
non-industry, but the approach is slightly different with each. But I think...
That's interesting. How so?
Yeah, well, I think that, as you mentioned, I worked in academia, and I think, it's a very privileged environment, academia, and you're sort of nicely ensconced, in your lab.
When it's very safe, you mean?
It feels safe. I mean, it's not necessarily because, you have to apply for grant funding and all of those things, unless you have tenure. But it's safe. It is quite a safe thing. The pressures are different. To say, for example, if you were coming from clinical practice where, there's inherent momentum and huge pressure simply from, treating patients, that's a really often very fast pace. You feel the pressure of it on a day-to-day basis, which is slightly different to academia. Now, I'm sort of rambling a little bit because I'm bringing myself to what's the common thing that I would recommend to people coming out of either of those practices is somehow or other to develop some commercial acumen.
Yeah.
But to be very focused on that, because that is, it's critical. If you're coming into biotech or coming into pharma, biotech I think more than pharma, you have to be focused on, even as a CMO, building a story behind what it is that you're developing, building a story behind your clinical development, behind your asset. Mm-hmm. Where are we heading commercially? Is this ultimately a commercially viable product? You always have to have that end in mind, even in your very, very earliest preclinical studies. You have to ask yourself repeatedly, is this going to take off commercially? And there are various factors, I think, that determine that. Is it even practical? How is it going? It goes back to that clinical workflow. How is it going to work from a clinical workflow perspective? Et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that's an pretty important question. Skill, perhaps, to have.
I can imagine that to get to become a CMO, you have to be. There's a mission. There's a drive. What is it that's kept you driven and motivated to get to the way you are today, and to go, to suddenly become a physician midway through your career, for example? Yeah,
I mean, I'll go back again to the curiosity component. Very important for me, and that's how I am. It's how I'm built, but it certainly drives me. And again, this is perhaps overused, but I like to be challenged. So that drives me. So that sort of took me to, as we've already discussed, to study medicine, but then to carry on in the roles that I've been on. It's absolutely delivering products for patients. Again, I think it sounds a little overused, but it is. It's a driver. And then day to day, I really do enjoy working with teams. I really gain a lot of satisfaction and gratification from seeing teams develop, seeing them happy. And truly, having a happy team is a good thing for me, and they're more creative. Happy teams are more productive. Happy teams are more productive. They do better work. It's really delightful for me to see a team working well together, even across time zones and geographies. So that keeps me going.
I'm conscious of time. I've got one final question. What is it that, what kind of key achievements or milestones that you've achieved in the drug development sense? What has been your greatest?
Oh gosh, that's
It gets you fulfilled.
Yeah, the greatest achievement. I really have to go back to 20 years ago. Just makes it seem as though I haven't been achieving much in the intervening period. But it maybe wasn't an achievement, but it was a significant moment for me. And this is when I started in the clinical application of radiopharmaceuticals. So I did my PhD in radiopharmaceuticals, but as I was doing my PhD, it was very abstract. It was because there wasn't a clinical application. And then I got my first job working in a hospital as a hospital radiopharmaceutical chemist. I was very fortunate to work with a couple of clinicians who I think were very bold, and they pushed the boundaries. And I've carried that with me, actually, that sort of sense. I wouldn't say I'm bold, but that sense of sort of pushing the boundaries. But what I'm coming to is that, together with those people, we started a clinical therapeutic program in Radiotheranostics. And it was something that, we'd been trying to do, or that group had been trying to do for a period of time. And I guess it was just a coincidence of having the right set of people working together at the right time that we started with what's now Lutathera, lutetium octreotate.
Yeah, of course,
I went off to Erasmus. I sort of learnt the technology, which now seems very straightforward. Then wasn't.
So before AAA acquired the technology?
It was, yep.
Because who was it? Was it Mallinckrodt that had it before that?
Well, no, it just came out of Erasmus Medical Centre. So Queckenboom and Krenning were the two physicians, and then there were a whole bunch of, obviously, chemists and others that worked with them. So we started that program, a couple of programs back in Australia. And that's when I became hooked on radiopharmaceuticals, and I saw the patient outcomes and the images from these patients, and we were able to see disease that they otherwise didn't know they had, which is, that's kind of a mixed story, and whether you might see it as positive or negative, but we had clinical insights that we previously didn't have. So being able to work together with that team to bring that therapy to patients was for me, a really significant achievement personally, and for patients and for the group that we were working with, and it really started me, in terms of the passion. So
you got the bug.
It did. I did.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Lawrence.
I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast today.
Me too.
Especially because you're probably busy between Bio 2025.
My pleasure, Lawrence. It's been great chatting to you. Really enjoyed it.
And if anyone from the audience wants to reach out to you, what do you suggest they do?
Well, look, they can catch me on LinkedIn, of course. Always welcome messages on LinkedIn. People are welcome to send me an email, danielle.meyrick@epictheranostics.com. Probably the best ways to catch me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence.